One of the reasons why many political observers have such a difficult time trying to describe or explain Donald Trump is because Donald Trump's political track record really only began when he started to run for president in 2015. Sure, he said things in the past, but he hadn't really taken a detailed stance on a plethora of issues, and certainly he had never governed anything or served in a legislative body. However, most other presidents did serve in some capacity in government before being elected to the presidency. And in the case of George W. Bush, what I think we'll see is that when he was governor of Texas, he exhibited many of the same qualities that he would bring to the White House: cronyism and a more or less complete indifference to structural issues. So, today what I'd like to do is take a look at George W. Bush's governorship of Texas from 1995 to 2001, look at the circumstances which produced him, and also see how his governorship helped to propel him to the forefront of the 2000 election, which of course would ultimately lead to him becoming president. So let's take a look at the deeper context of the 1994 gubernatorial election. When George W. Bush decided to run for governor of Texas in 1994, his opponent was incumbent governor Ann Richards. Ann Richards was a Democrat in Texas politics, and she was active throughout the 70s and 80s. Her chief attributes as a politician were that she was a known feminist at a time and place where not many politicians identified openly as such, and her sort of chief skill as a politician was the ability to deliver witty and sometimes even devastating one-liners. Now, this was a skill that would sometimes bite her in the ass a little bit because there was sometimes a perception that she had gone too far. But for the most part, this was a positive attribute as it is now. In fact, I can't help but think that had Twitter existed in the 80s and 90s, Ann Richards would have been a major star on that platform, and her political career would not have ended as early as it did. Ann Richards really came to national prominence, however, for her 1988 DNC speech, where she said that she had to speak at the convention so that Democrats would know what a real Texas accent sounds like, and she said that George H.W. Bush just couldn't get it right because he always had one silver foot in his mouth. So she had a real knack for taking the Bushes to task, and she played the real Texan versus fake Texan card pretty well. In 1990, she only narrowly won the governor's race, however, 49 to 47%, and that was despite her opponent making a huge series of gaffes. Her opponent said a lot of things which were really off color and turned people away. And even so, Ann Richards, who ran a pretty strong campaign by all the traditional thinking of the day, still barely managed to pull it out. Her opponent engaged in some dirty tactics which many Texans found to be beneath the dignity of the governor's mansion. They accused her of being an alcoholic, and there was even a flyer that was sent around that said that Richards would bring death to the American family. Presumably this was a reference to her known pro-gay rights stance when she was in Texas government legislature. So, Ann Richards managed to ride out the negative campaigning, and she managed to take power, and she governed from 1991 until 1995. If you've already seen my video on the rise of neoliberalism, then you know that the two parties were not terribly distinct during the 80s and early 90s. Both of them seemed to stand for broadly the same things. So Ann Richards, for that reason, was basically just a neoliberal or Southern Democrat, and her performance is a mixed bag, much like what her neighbor in Arkansas, Bill Clinton, produced for his state. She did manage to oversee the end of Texas's economic recession, which had dated back to the mid-80s, by some stimulus spending. She achieved 2% growth in Texas in 1991 when the rest of the nation was in a recession which probably helped to end the Bush senior administration, by the way. She also, though, was in favor of deregulation and streamlining corporate regulations, meaning that she bought into the Republican talking point and platform of deregulating businesses and setting them loose. She did create a substance abuse program for inmates and release some nonviolent offenders. That's a fairly typical Democratic thing to do. However, the prison population grew from 60,000 to about 80,000 between 1992 and 1994. The 90s was a decade when tough on crime was just a given for anyone. And this is especially true after the lesson of 1988, where the Willie Horton ad really destroyed Michael Dukakis' campaign almost completely. So every Democrat had to go out of their way to prove just how tough they were on crime. In fact, Bill Clinton, when he was running for president in 1992, actually left the campaign trail to make sure that a mentally handicapped offender would be executed, even though some psychologists said that this person was mentally incompetent to hold full culpability for his actions. At any rate, though, on education, Ann Richards had what was called the Robin Hood Plan. This was where resources were redistributed from richer districts to poorer districts to make sure that there was a more even educational experience for all Texans. Texas is a land of great inequality. It has only become more so over time, but even in the 90s, this was already the case. She also instituted the state lottery to help fund education. That is more of a Republican Southern idea. Every state in the South has an education lottery, and then in a lot of cases what happens is the lottery will initially produce more funding for education, but then state lawmakers will say, hey, look, we have a source of revenue for education already in the lottery, so we'll cut other means of funding it, and then education in the long run ends up being less funded, or at least less normally funded, less reliably funded, because lotteries are things that are not completely reliable sources of revenue. Ann Richards, despite her known pro-gay stances, in 1993 signed the Texas Penal Code, and one of the provisions of the Texas Penal Code revision was that homosexual acts were deemed a misdemeanor. Now, they weren't a serious misdemeanor, but still, it was criminalizing gay sex, which would go against almost anything that, say, a modern Democrat would believe in. However, this was the 90s, and the official stance of the Democratic Party was anti-gay, but we don't hate gay people, basically where conservative Republicans are at today. She also did try to implement gun control, and she proposed a ban on cop-killer bullets. However, one thing that was true about the 90s that the neoliberals actually kind of do get right is that on social issues, the 90s actually were pretty conservative when it came to guns. The 90s and 2000s were the high tide of the NRA's influence. And I think that this issue might have actually really been behind Ann Richards' defeat to George W. Bush, or it might have played a major role that is sometimes not quite emphasized enough. One of the long-term consequences of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed by a Democratic Congress under Lyndon Baines Johnson, and then Nixon's Southern strategy, which exploited racial tension, was that in the South, it went from being a solidly Democratic area to being an area which voted heavily for Republicans, first at a national level, and then later also at a state level. This process often just gets summarized as if it were a single event which took place between about 1968 and 1972, and as if Nixon pulled it off by himself. But that's not quite true. The process actually ran its course between about 1968, when there started to be some backlash for the Civil Rights Act, and when many white Southerners began to migrate to the Republican side, and 2010, when Democratic state governments in Kentucky and North Carolina fell to the Republicans for the first time in a very long time. Because even though on a national level they had been voting Republican for years, at a state level people had split their vote and kept Democrats in office. But 2010 is really when the Southern strategy came to full fruition. And actually now we're seeing this hold on the South start to weaken as places like Georgia and North Carolina, Virginia are starting to become fairly competitive. Anyway, what we do see is that for Ann Richards, the Southern strategy came to Texas at just the wrong time. In 1990, Richards had won barely, despite running a far better campaign than her opponent. And in my mind, what this indicates is that the Southern strategy really came to full fruition in Texas by about 1990 to 1994 at the very latest. I would say 1990 is probably a better date because Richards had to run circles around her opponent to just squeak out a victory. And also there was a Libertarian candidate who carried about 3 point something % of the vote, And if all those votes had gone Republican, then Williams would have been governor rather than Richards. At any rate, though. So this is something that really helped George W. Bush and his gubernatorial hopes. Ann Richards once said of George W. Bush that he was born on third, but was deluded into thinking that he had hit a triple, and this is one example where she was 100% accurate when it came to diagnosing George W. Bush's mental status and also his place in the world. Another factor which greatly aided George W. Bush's ambition to become governor was the Red Wave of 1994, which is often called the Republican Revolution. This was one of the largest wave elections in American history. So, what caused it? Well, there was a combination of factors. I think that the biggest factor was the early failure of Bill Clinton to really establish a new Democratic brand that people wanted to vote for. He combined milquetoast New Democrat rhetoric with some policies that were pretty moderate. And at the same time, though, he combined that with a clearly left policy on healthcare. He wanted to create a single-payer system, but then he delegated it to Hillary, the First Lady, someone who at that time had no political experience. So it smacked of cronyism to some extent, but it also, more importantly, looked like what Republicans would call big government. Bill Clinton's New Democrat rhetoric was that the age of big government was over. So he was sending mixed messages in the eyes of many voters, especially Republicans. And they began to label him as a tax and spend liberal, one of the dumbest labels in political history, since obviously all politicians, regardless of how much money they spend or what they spend it on, are tax and spend, insert an ideology. However, people ate this shit up, and Newt Gingrich's rhetoric was distributed on cassette tapes across the country. And yes, I'm not kidding, cassette tapes, because it's 1994. Anyway, so this meant that the Democratic vote was somewhat suppressed because people just weren't feeling Bill Clinton that much after he had failed to deliver health care. And Republicans, though, were super motivated. And they were ready to go out and stop Bill Clinton's evil leftist agenda. So the result is that the Republicans carried 54 House seats, 9 Senate seats. That gave them control of Congress as a whole for the first time since 1952. They managed to gain 20 state legislatures, 12 governorships, and that was enough to really change the scape of the 90s politically. The chief document of this time was Newt Gingrich's contract with America, where he laid out a Republican agenda which promised fiscal responsibility, tax cuts, tort reform, welfare reform, a tough stance on crime, etc. And we see that those kind of policies, except for tort reform, were instituted on both the state and national level, including by the Clinton administration, since he basically just surrendered to Republican priorities after the 1994 midterms. So it should come as no surprise that once George W. Bush comes into office, and of course his run was greatly aided by this momentum, this is basically what George W. Bush is going to try to do. This is what people were supporting Republicans to do at this time. In 1994, George W. Bush's platform revolved around 4 themes: welfare reform, tort reform, crime reduction, and education improvement. And it was around this time, partly led by Bill Clinton, who was really fond of making things in short lists for easy memorization and digestion, that governors and other candidates would start to run on platforms that were reduced to list of themes, rather than long, winding list of issues that aren't categorized under a subheading. In fact, had Hillary Clinton run her campaign this way in 2016, by having some key themes which then you could elaborate upon further, she might have actually done a lot better. But anyway, so let's look at these themes. Welfare reform. This is something that Republicans across the country had been eager for ever since Reagan first uttered the words welfare queen. And the 1990s will see this go down. Bill Clinton, of course, was the primary architect of this, even though he lost the midterm election precisely because people wanted the Republicans to achieve that. But then he went and did the bidding of the Republicans, because that's how neoliberalism works in practice. Tort reform is basically the idea of disallowing large scale class action lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies and other abusers who produce products which damage, injure, or sicken a large number of people. Individually, it is very difficult to sue a large corporation. That's why class action lawsuits exist. However, in the 90s, the Republicans were pretty effective at painting lawyers as the real bad guys who were taking advantage of these victims and then hampering business operations because of their liberal agenda. Tort reform, of course, never really completely took off, and part of it is because it doesn't really have the kind of populist appeal that things like tax cuts or guns have. But Republicans ran on it pretty proudly and pretty openly, and that probably helps account in large part for the increases in donations that they got. This was the part of their platform aimed at their corporate constituents. Now they just know that Republicans stand for tort reform. They don't put it on the platform as much anymore, or they just say they're pro-business, and it's kind of understood that this is part of it. They also ran on crime reduction. The 90s, again, is basically just all about cracking down on crime. All of those 80s action movies like Cobra, where you just have to take out the trash. People kind of wanted to take that and make it a policy. And then education improvement, which is the vaguest possible way for state-level politicians to tell their constituents that they're going to make their lives better. And it probably did not come with very many specifics until later. Of course, George W. Bush would later prove to be a big fan of standardized testing, but I don't think he actually ran on that. I could be wrong about that point, though. Another thing that Bush ran on, which was probably a pretty big factor, was he ran on allowing concealed carry. And he also clashed with Ann Richards over gun issues in general. He was opposed to any kind of ban on what she labeled as cop killer bullets or assault weapons. Republicans, one of the major bones of contentions between the two parties is that Democrats use the term assault rifles, and Republicans say that there's no such thing. There's also the issue of Bush engaging in a bit of playing to homophobic biases among the population. This is something that he would take to a whole different level in 2004, but he sort of was running the beta version in 1994. In the media, he was quoted as attacking Richards for appointing avowed homosexual activists to state jobs. And Richards did have some homosexuals holding positions of power in Texas. But Bush tried to just give enough of an insinuation that there was like a big gay takeover of the state that it would frighten some more conservative-minded voters to want Ann Richards out of office. Bush's campaign, surprisingly given his later reputation, ran smoothly without any major gaffes. It was arguably Karl Rove's finest production. Bush defeated Richards by quite a bit, 53.5 to 45.9%. Despite being outspent by 23%, Richards had ingratiated herself with the corporate powers that be in Texas, like oil companies. And despite the fact that Richards had been a reasonably successful governor, not wildly successful, but certainly not a flaming failure. So this was a major victory for Bush, and I think that he owes a lot of this to the gun issue, the red wave of 94, and also the Southern strategy kicking in at that time, the way that it did in Texas. When we think back on George W. Bush now, we tend to think of him as being essentially a neoconservative. However, before he was a neoconservative, he was just a garden variety neoliberal. He was someone who wanted to play buddy-buddy with corporations and then just do whatever he needed to do social policy-wise to make sure that his corporate friends got paid. His governorship, in other words, was definitional of 1990s neoliberal politics, and it also set a lot of patterns that he would follow as president, as it established his style of governing. When Richards left office, she left a budget surplus to George W. Bush. This is, of course, something that would happen later when he became president. So what does Bush do with this budget surplus? Texas has a low-rated education system, high levels of obesity, teen pregnancy, poverty, inequality, environmental problems, there are plenty of things Texas could use that money for. But George W. Bush decides to pass a massive tax cut. He passes a $2 billion tax cut, the largest in Texas history, and then the surplus is gone, and his opportunity to really improve anyone's life is gone with that. Because unlike the federal government, state governments cannot engage in deficit spending because they don't have the kind of credit that the country has. However, he did make himself into the so-called compassionate conservative that he would run as in 2000. One of the things that he did offer government funding for were organizations offering education on the dangers of alcohol and drug use, and he also took steps to reduce domestic violence. George W. Bush himself had been an alcoholic earlier in his life, so this was something that he could speak about fairly eloquently, in contrast to when he tried to speak about any other topic. Bush also claimed that his education policies increased teacher salaries and test scores, although there have been people who have tried to dispute that. And given the mixed reviews of No Child Left Behind, I think that it's hard to either outright condemn or outright accept these claims. It was a mixed bag at best. Unlike most of Bush's outright failures, No Child Left Behind was more negative than positive, but not a complete and total boondoggle in the way that, say, the Iraq War was. Throughout his political career, George W. Bush was largely funded by energy companies and oil companies, ranging from Enron to Exxon. So it should come as no surprise that he has never been a friend of the environment. During his tenure as governor, Texas ranked low on environmental regulations, and Bush tended to push for relaxing regulations across the board, another tendency that he would bring with him to the White House and inflict on the entire country. However, just as when he was president, there was one big bright spot to his environmental policies. In 1999, George W. Bush actually signed a law that required electric retailers to buy some percentage of their energy from renewable sources. And ultimately, what we've seen is that in the years since 2000, all of Texas's expanding energy needs have actually been met by wind energy. So Texas does consume more energy, but they only consume the same amount of carbon-emitting energy as they did when Bush left office as governor. And this was a direct result of his policies. So this is one area where, as governor, he did something that was pretty positive. However, in general, his stance of cooperation with business and industry, i.e. self-regulation, would prove to be completely disastrous, both in terms of environmental policy and later when he had the opportunity to apply that philosophy to banking regulations. After the Willie Horton ad of 1988, the 1990s went on to become the decade of death row. Each governor, especially governors in southern states, were really eager to prove that they were tough on crime and that they had balls. So they executed as many people as they could within reason. George W. Bush was someone who decided to take this to the nth degree, and most likely this had a lot to do with the fact that he was the son of the guy who got this trend going. He presided over the most executions of any American governor since the reimplementation of the death penalty on a national level in 1976. Of course, it wasn't legal in every state, but still, it does happen in a lot of them, and Texas and Florida are among the two biggest users of the death penalty. There were some individual cases where George W. Bush managed to elicit praise pieces in local papers for sticking to principle and showing mercy on occasion. Once he refused the pleas of a born-again Christian. Usually George W. Bush would bend over backwards for anyone claiming to love Jesus. But in this case, he did not believe that the man was innocent or reformed, and he rejected his pleas. That impressed people with Bush's even-handedness. And there was another case where there was someone who was a serial killer, but one of the murders that he was convicted on was proven to have been based on faulty evidence, and Bush actually stayed his execution. So people looked at Bush as being someone who used this power wisely. However, the damage that Bush did was not on an individual basis as someone who could sign death warrants, but rather on a larger institutional basis. What Bush and his followers in the state government did was streamline the appeals process. And effectively, what that means is that inmates who were on death row had a shorter period of time during which to appeal their case, and that meant that they would be executed faster. Of course, this also means that for someone trying to prove their innocence, they now had to do so on a much shorter time frame, which meant that this increased the number of people who died while not being guilty. Of course, George W. Bush would later say that he is very confident that he never executed a single innocent person. The model was praised for its efficiency by some other governors, like Jeb Bush of Florida, his brother, who also had to live up to the Bush name by sticking at the criminals with electric shockers. The context, of course, as I mentioned, was the aftermath of the Willie Horton ad of 1988, which made the 1990s the decade of death row. Bill Clinton, as governor of Arkansas, was also execution happy, as I mentioned earlier. And so George W. Bush was not unique, but he was leading a trend, which was a decidedly negative one. One of the most sickening features of the Bush administration is that while president, George W. Bush would really pander to the likes of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, people who are absolute shit stains on the history of this country. And this long track record of appealing to the worst elements of Christianity in America began when George W. Bush was governor of Texas. During his second term, which started in 1999, George W. Bush began to promote faith-based organizations with tax money. This policy was very popular. However, many people, myself included, believe that this violates the separation of church and state. And of course, George W. Bush would continue this practice while president, because, hey, it got him some brownie points with the Jesus freaks back when he was governor. Why not try it again on a national level and see what happens? After all, there are evangelicals in southern Ohio and Iowa and plenty of other areas that you might need to carry to win the presidency. His worst single offense in terms of the optics of it and in terms of really just pandering a little too hard for anyone's taste came during the middle of the 2000 campaign when on June 10th, 2000, he declared Jesus Day in Texas. And he urged all Texans to answer the call to serve those in need on that day. So, again, we'll talk more about Jesus Day when we get to the 2000 election itself, but for now, suffice it to say that part of George W. Bush's political model was pandering to some of the worst instincts in people, whether it was their fear of Muslims later, their fear of the gays, or their weird sense of Christian victimhood, even though they're in a country that's majority Christian. Anyway, this was George W. Bush 101, and he had honed his craft of bullshit well before he came to office. I've never liked the term political science because I think that it fundamentally misinterprets what politics is. Politics is not an objective practice. To the degree that it could be an objective practice, the only objective way to actually measure success is based on winning or losing elections and popularity while in office. And in that one regard, this objective level of was this person elected and popular, George W. Bush was a successful governor. He won re-election in 1998 with a record 69% of the vote, and that was enough to make him the first back-to-back two-term governor in Texas since the implementation of four-year terms in 1975. So if we're just viewing it on the most basic terms, George W. Bush did succeed as governor of Texas. However, what I really want to think about is the difference between popularity and performance, or the difference between whether people agree with you and whether you're actually correct. So let's look at another feature of what Bush's time in Texas taught him. One thing that he learned while in Texas politics is how to outreach to Hispanics. He was one of, if not the best Republicans at reaching out to Hispanic voters and winning their support. Now, Republicans under Bush would never win a majority of Hispanics. However, they would cut heavily into the margin that Democrats would win. So instead of, say, losing by 70-30, Bush would only lose by 60-40. And in many cases, that was enough to put him over the top. Even during his first term, Bush was considered a presidential hopeful for 2000 because of his performance as governor and also because he had a famous family name. Name recognition is huge, and bearing the same name as a former president who, while not wildly popular, was someone who was still well known and generally not hated, that's a major asset. And again, George W. Bush inherited a pretty easy situation. Ann Richards, again, famously said that George W. Bush started on third but thought that he had hit a triple. In the 90s, the economy grew across the board, and that helped him out in Texas. The country was turning to the right because the Democrats caved in to the demands of the Republicans, and Republicans were able to fulfill most of their agenda items, which then made someone like George W. Bush look like a star, since he could claim to be legitimately for these things rather than just going along with it like a Bill Clinton. So, I leave you with this question for now. How successful was George W. Bush as governor? Again, objectively, it put him on the path to the presidency, and he was popular. But if we look more into it, did he really do anything that helped Texas in the long run aside from the wind energy thing? Well, let's take a look. Judging the performance of any individual governor can be somewhat difficult because you also have to take into account national trends which really set the playing field for these governors. And that's why I've tried to integrate discussion of the Clinton presidency and the Republican Revolution with the Bush governorship. However, we can still look at a few numbers and maybe get an idea of what George W. Bush did and didn't accomplish as governor of Texas in the 6 years that he was in office. Median income went up by about $8,000, which was pretty close to what it went up in the U.S. as a whole. If anything, Texas did a little bit better than the U.S. as a whole, even if it was still massively behind by the time that 2000 rolled around. Since 2000, by fits and starts, Texas has caught up to the median income for the nation, minus a few $100s. Interestingly enough, though, that $58,000 figure that we see in 2000 was not surpassed until 2016, when it finally hit 59 after years of fluctuating and even going down. So it's not so much that Texas really caught up by prospering, so much as the rest of the country has sucked worse than Texas, and Texas has seen some growth since 2000. A lot of that I can't really attribute to state politics, though. A lot of that just has to do with oil reserves and the growth of a tech industry in places like Houston. Anyway, Texas now produces the most CO2 of any state, even more than California, although it's only about average on a per capita output. So if we look at how much each Texan uses, it's actually less than a whole lot of other states. A lot of that is because Texas doesn't get super cold, so you don't have to worry about heating oil like you do in places like Alaska or Maine or somewhere like that. And both of these trends are very much in line with what we saw with Bush's environmental policies. He didn't do much to limit CO2 output. In fact, he did nothing. He had no interest in it. But at the same time, he did mandate an investment in wind energy. So a lot of the extra production that Texas has needed since 2000 has been produced by wind, which of course then means that the carbon footprint of each Texan is kept to a certain level. So both of these trends are easily attributable to George W. Bush's time as governor, and I would say that this is a little more positive than negative. Bush's performance overall strikes me as pretty average and unremarkable. I can't really say he's one of the worst governors ever, because he's not. But he also doesn't stand out as being an excellent governor. He didn't really do anything that is all that noteworthy in the grand scheme of things. What he did do was fit the bill for what Republicans wanted in the 90s, and that is what made him a 2000 candidate. George W. Bush, in other words, was popular, but his performance was pretty damn meh. Just like almost every other 90s governor, including the guy who came before him, Bill Clinton. But of course, we'll talk about Bill Clinton in an entirely different video or series. For now, though, that is everything that I have to say about the Bush governorship, and we'll see many of these same trends in terms of corporate cronyism and environmental deregulation, the concept of self-regulation. All of these things will be coming back in full force once George W. Bush takes office. But before we can get to any of that, we have to look at the 2000 election, and that will be the topic of the next video in this series. Until then, I'm Thersites the Historian.